what's the difference between the Templar Knights, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights? All three religious orders were the holy bad boys of the Crusades, combining the life of the monk with that of a warrior, and they played a crucial role in protecting Christian pilgrims, defending the Holy Land, and most importantly, spanking the infidel. The first of the three orders to form was the Hospitallers, who actually started out not stabbing people. Their origins date to a hospital in Jerusalem devoted to St. John the Baptist, founded by Italian merchants in the mid to late 11th century to care for Christian pilgrims, which after the First Crusade and conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, it rapidly grew in importance. In 1113, the hospital was recognised as an order by the Pope, granting them special privileges and papal protection. Known as the Order of the Hospital of St. John, or the Hospitallers for short, they looked across the road and saw the Templars having far too much fun swinging their swords at the non-believers and wanted in on the action, where they soon turned to armed ventures beyond their initial medical services. Enter Hugh de Paynes, a French knight who in 1119, inspired by the charitable work of the Hospitallers, also wanted to help the pilgrims, but with what he knew best: violence. He leads a small group of knights to defend Christian pilgrims making the dangerous route of the Holy Land's version of the M25 from Jaffa to Jerusalem, which was regularly patrolled by bandits and highwaymen. Hugh's exploits earn him clout from the big men in Jerusalem, where his team soon gets recognised as a spiritual order, as well as being given headquarters near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is associated with the Temple of Solomon, where they get their name from as poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or Knights Templar for short. They took vows of chastity, poverty and obedience, devoting their life to God like monks, and they also combined this with the ideals of knighthood, aiming to defend the Holy Land against the Saracens. While the Templars started off as absolute povos, relying only on donations as emphasised by their emblem, which was two knights riding only one horse, they soon became absolutely minted, with Europeans learning about their great deeds and absolutely throwing money and land at them in order to support the war in the Holy Land. They also invented medieval banking, so you could deposit money in Europe and then pick it up in Jerusalem via a cheque. The virtues shown by the Templars were praised as they were said to be true knights of Christ, fighting the battles of the Lord and assured of glorious martyrdom should they fall and die in battle, which exemplified the Crusader ideology, which soon inspired the Hospitallers to draw their swords in around 1130. Both orders provided solutions to the problems the Latin East was facing, not enough soldiers to defend it. Crusading fever had declined over time, with huge armies like the First Crusade coming over to the Holy Land now only a distant memory, with many Crusaders only taking vows for 1 or 2 years and then going back home again, whereas these orders could field elite warriors of God full time. Soldiers from the orders made up roughly half of the Crusader armies, and they were usually the shock troops of the army as they were so good at fighting, and they fought with such fanatical devotion they either won against overwhelming odds or got absolutely slaughtered because they refused to retreat. In 1190, during the Siege of Acre in the Third Crusade, the Germans decided they wanted in on some of this holy action and were like, hold my bratwurst, setting up a field hospital during the siege and then taking over one inside the city, being recognised by the Pope 9 years later as a knightly order. They were known as the Order of Brothers of the German house St. Mary in Jerusalem, or the Teutonic Knights for short, getting their name from the Latin version of that, which contains Teutocorinum, something like that, which recognises their German roots. Fashion was of course as important in the Holy Land, and it gave us the ability to distinguish between the three. The Hospitallers often wearing black with white crosses or red with white crosses, the Templars white with red crosses, and the Teutonic Knights white with black crosses. The financial backing these orders got enabled them to recruit new members, upkeep the original ones, as well as build huge castles in the Holy Land and garrison them to defend it. However, when the last of the Christian holdings fell in the Holy Land in 1291, all three orders suffered very different fates. The Hospitallers enjoyed lads' holidays in Cyprus, Rhodes and then Malta, fragmenting over time, but with still humanitarian orders of St. John running today. On the other hand, the Templars weren't so lucky. They were put on trial by King Philip IV of France, who was in debt to them, and he extracted confessions of heresy through torture before disbanding them in 1312 with help from the Pope, likely as a front to take all of their riches. The Teutonic Knights, who were already operating in the Baltics against the pagans, now focused all of their attentions there, where they were decisively beaten off at Grunwald in 1410, where they soon declined, but they still run today as charitable organisations out of Vienna. So have you heard of the Crusading Order which fielded zombie knights on the battlefield? The Order of St. Lazarus of Jerusalem, or the Leper Brothers of Jerusalem, initially started as a Hospitaller spin-off episode as a hospital specifically caring for those with the terrible disease of leprosy. A disease which earned the sufferers a comparison with the living dead as your flesh rotted, your skeleton disfigured and your limbs eventually fell off, with it believed you could get this disease just by breathing in the same air as the afflicted. Which isn't too far from the truth as it's caught by prolonged contact with the sufferer, and we're lucky it's curable today, but back then it was an absolute death sentence, with these hospitals aiming not to cure the patients but to relieve their suffering through good diet, sleep and baths. Some thought it was divine punishment by God, however others thought that due to the horrendous suffering they endured here on earth it was likened to Christ's and the ultimate test of righteousness, so when they went to heaven, they'd have a VIP lounge waiting for them. It was also said if you made charitable donations to them or cared for them, you'd receive time off your purgatory visit and get a gilded trip to heaven. And they received donations from the big dogs in Jerusalem, with one of the most fascinating ones being King Almeric, the father to the future King Baldwin IV, who was the Leper King. Named after the leper's patron St. Lazarus, little is known about the order compared to the other big ones, but they soon separated from the Hospitallers, becoming their own monastic order, open to brothers with leprosy, as well as healthy ones who were separated in their day-to-day lives. To distinguish themselves from the other orders, they wore a green cross upon white, and until 1253 it was actually a requirement for their Grand Master to be a leper himself, which was eventually repealed by the Pope upon request of the brothers because they ran out of lepers within the order, which I'll touch on in a moment when we get to their military activities. By the late 12th century, the code was that any knight or sergeant who contracted leprosy in the Holy Land was to join the order, with his wife becoming a nun and his property passing to his heirs, and if he didn't have any, it went to the Lord. Leprous Templars did initially have the choice whether they rotted with the Brothers of Lazarus or not, which eventually became an obligation in 1260 due to the close ties between the two orders. However, the Hospitallers had no such rule, likely as they could care for their own sick. While there's no evidence that the order had any military activities to begin with like their counterparts, the influx of knights retaining their knightly status and not ostracised like some lepers eventually encouraged the order to militarise. By 1234 the noose was tightening around Crusader states by the Muslims and Christian manpower was severely lacking, with the Pope issuing an appeal for any man who could to defend the Holy Land. In the dire circumstances, they take any man they could, even decaying knights, and it made perfect sense to exploit the skills of these trained warriors while they weren't on their deathbeds yet. Even those in the early stages would still be able to fight, as showcased by King Baldwin IV, who rode into battle despite not being able to use one arm. And it's likely leprous knights would still want to fight due to the honour combat brought, and it's a lot better way to go out than decaying slowly. And even if they couldn't strike with their swords anymore, I'm sure sneezing on the enemy would be just as effective in the long run. The living dead mobilised and the Crusaders effectively used the first zombie army in history. However, the records we have for them show their fighting careers were an absolute disaster. The Battle of Forby in 1244 was an absolute bloodbath and saw all the Knights of Lazarus killed, as well as most of the Templars, Teutonic Knights and Hospitallers who were present at the battle. They then took part in the disastrous 7th Crusade, and then a few years later a raid into Muslim territory was decisively beaten off. It's said that after these disasters, every leper knight had been miserably killed off by the enemy of the faith, which is why in 1253 they requested to the Pope that their Grand Master not be actively decomposing. 25 Knights of the Order made a final stand at the Siege of Acre in 1291 in the Crusaders' final moments in the Holy Land, where apparently along with a few other troops, they led an assault out of the city at night time to destroy enemy siege engines. However, apparently their horses tripped on the enemy's tents, alerting them to their presence, where they were soon slaughtered. They soon abandoned their military ventures after the Christians were kicked out of the Holy Land, where they soon merged with other European orders, where they only survive today in Italy as the Order of St. Maurice and Lazarus.